All right, good morning. Will everybody that's not here please stand up? We got a Spartan crew this morning. But we're thankful that you are here. We appreciate your presence here today. We're going to be studying the book of Mark in just a little while, and we want you to involve yourselves in that study. This is the day which Jehovah has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. So we are rejoicing today and we're glad, right? So we're going to have a good time here today with each other. We're going to smile at each other and greet each other warmly as brothers and sisters, and we're going to encourage each other. Life is hard out there, you know that. And we come in here to kind of this sanctuary away from those things to build each other up. So let's work to accomplish that. I want to try to cover two sections of Scripture this morning. And it's probably going to take it. We may not get that. That's my hope and my prospect. But if we don't, then we'll have another Sunday. If we don't and the Lord comes, it won't make any difference, right? So let's look at the book of Mark, and I want you to join me in chapter 2. And we're going to look at verses 18 through 22, which is drawing us to the end of the second chapter of Mark. And here we're going to see a situation where the Pharisees approach Jesus with a question about fasting. Now, you read the parallel accounts of this. You'll find a parallel in Matthew 9, 14 through 17. You'll find one in Luke chapter 5, 33 through 39. And those will help to make the account fuller. They'll give us fill in some gaps. I think it's Matthew says that John's disciples came. Here we see the disciples of John and the Pharisees come. I think Matthew just says they came. So these folks approach Jesus with this particular question. So let's read it first, and then I want to come back and do again what I call some brush clearing, if you will, that I hope will help us to identify and interpret exactly what this passage is saying. In Richie's opinion, this is a passage that has been abused and misused to teach some things that I don't think it teaches at all. These are my conclusions based on my study. I'm going to share with you my reasoning of those things, and then it's up to you as Bible students to go and do further research into the passage. But almost every commentator that I have read, and even those in the church, often I think misapply this passage. And I'm not saying that to say that I'm brilliant or I'm a step ahead of anybody else. I don't mean that at all. But then again, this is another one of those cases where you have to look at all of these records and you have to analyze what the writers say in view of what others have said about it. And here's another time where me personally, this is my way of phrasing things, I'm going to get down and I'm going to wrestle with this text because I want to get out of this text what it really says. And so it required of me in years gone by to hunker down, get a good glass of iced tea and go to the office and close the door and just open the book and me and God together wrestle with this text. And I'm satisfied personally, and I think it would be true of you too, that when we approach these texts this way, with this dogged determination to want to know what this text really says and how I can use it and bless my life and bless the lives of others, I think God's going to yield that up to us. But I don't think it's necessarily going to be easy for us. Bible study, folks, is hard work. If it were easy, everybody would do it. And the reason everybody doesn't do it is because it is hard work. It will exhaust you physically and mentally to wrestle with God. But I'm just like Jacob. Jacob wrestled with God and prevailed. And so, I think I can wrestle with God on these texts, and if I have that dogged determination, I think God's going to yield it up. So that's Richie's approach to this. And with that said, let's read the text. And John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And they came and say unto him, Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples fast not? And Jesus said unto them, Can the sons of the bride chamber fast when the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of undressed cloth on an old garment, else that which should fill it up, takes from it the new from the old, and a worse rent is made. And no man puts new wine into old wineskins, else the wine will burst the skins, and the wine perishes and the skins. But they put new wine into fresh wineskins. Now, let's begin, and again, these are Richie's approaches to this, but let's ask ourselves a question. How do we properly interpret this text? And the reason I say that is because I think this text has been misapplied and misused. And so we want to get to the proper interpretation of it and the proper application of it so that we don't use it in ways that are unjustifiable. So let's begin by asking a question. What generated this dialogue? Here's a dialogue between Jesus and John's disciples and the Pharisees' disciples. They have this discussion. And when you study the Bible, in particular in the Gospels, and you have these encounters of Jesus with groups or persons, and you look at the parables, in many instances, if not in most, there's going to be some situation or there's going to be some question that generates this dialogue. It doesn't just happen willy-nilly. There's something that occurs here that generates this dialogue between Jesus and these people. So I've given you plenty of time to think about that question. What's the answer to it?
Jesus' disciples weren't doing the same thing the other people were doing.
Which was? It's a question about fasting, right? So what does Jesus' answer have to do with then? What? Fasting. Right? Now, when you read most commentaries and see what just about every commentary, if not every single one that I read, is going to finally take this to a discussion between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And the New Covenant being better than the Old Covenant. Folks, is there anything here in this dialogue so far that relates to Old Covenant and New Covenant? What generated the dialogue? Fasting? No. Nothing here about the old law at all. The old law never makes an appearance in this text. The question that generates the dialogue is not a question about the two covenants. It's a question about fasting, and it's a question about fasting that doesn't have anything to do with the law.
But the Pharisees were under the law. They were questioning based upon their habits of fasting from the old law.
No. Their fasting was not regulated by the old law. There was one day in the old law that commanded fasting, and it didn't have anything to do with this.
But they thought it did. They were making the
No, they didn't. It was their tradition, Foster, that they were binding. But their traditions didn't have anything to do with Old Testament law. God commanded fasting on one day in the year. And the Pharisees had come along and they had placed all of their additional restrictions on themselves and others, but they were merely Pharisaical traditions that related not at all to the Old Testament law. You remember when the Pharisee and the publican go up to the temple to pray, Luke 18. And he said, what a good boy am I. I fast 2 days in the week. For the Pharisee, Tuesday and Thursday were fast days. And they bound this as Pharisaical tradition upon others. And they thought because they observed that made them better than others. Didn't have anything to do with the Mosaic law. And the question that I think should have been asked to that Pharisee who said, I fast twice a week is, well, who told you to do that? Nobody commanded you to do that. Now, is it okay if you want to do it? Sure. But didn't have anything to do with the Old Testament law. It was merely their tradition. That's what they're binding here, or these disciples are asking about. In fact, it seems, because one of the records says, we fast oft, that John's disciples had, to some degree at least, bought into this tradition of the Pharisees, and they were fasting like the Pharisees were. But this has nothing whatever to do with the Old Testament law, not at least as the law is given. Now, it has a lot to do with Pharisaic tradition, but not the Old Testament law. There is nothing in this dialogue that relates directly to the new covenant being better than the old covenant. That's the first thing we've got to get out of our heads if we're going to understand what this text is teaching. I wasn't going to do this, but maybe this is a good place to do it. Let me prove to you from the text that that's not the case. If you go over to Luke's account, okay? Go to Luke's account in chapter 5. And here you have Luke's account. Now come down to verse 39, Luke 5. And Jesus said, no man having drunk old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. Now, if this is a discussion between the covenants, then Jesus has said the old covenant is better than the new covenant. Does that appeal to you? Are y'all following me? It just won't work. The text won't permit that to work. And as I said, if we're going to really, I think, milk out of this text its proper understanding and application in what Jesus is teaching, we've got to first of all disabuse our minds that this is a discussion about Old Testament covenant and New Testament covenant, and the one being the better over the other. Y'all following me so far? Whether you agree or not, you follow where I'm going? The question about fasting here doesn't even relate to the one fast commanded in the Old Testament law, which was the Day of Atonement. That's the only day in the year that the law commanded fasting of the Jewish people. Y'all with me? Okay, you understand at least what I've said? So it doesn't even relate to that fast. So it's not a question about the covenants. It's a question about fasting. All right? So, what's Jesus' answer going to relate to? Sabra, what's the fasting? It's not new law, old law, it's fasting. What about fasting? Fasting according to Pharisaic tradition. That's what the discussion is all about. So this is where we've got to center our minds on what the discussion is about, because if we go afield, guess what? If you have poor hermeneutical principles, and if you employ improper biblical hermeneutics, you're never going to get to a right conclusion. It's impossible for us to. And I think that's why this text has been misunderstood. It's a question about fasting. Why do these disciples fast often? Not the Day of Atonement. Why do these disciples fast often and your disciples don't? So let's look at Jesus' answer. And he answers this in three ways. He gives three illustrations. He's first of all going to talk about a marriage celebration or ceremony. He's going to talk about patching an old garment, and he's going to thirdly talk about fermenting wine. And he's going to use three illustrations to do that. So ask another question. What do these illustrations illustrate? All right, marriage ceremony. Let's take that first of all, his first illustration. And he talks about the sons of the bride chamber and the bridegroom. Now who do you think the sons of the bride chamber are? Huh? The disciples. The sons of the bride chamber, this means the friends of the groom, the companions of the groom. How would we do that today in common parlance? Who would we call these folks? That's the best man and the groomsman. Okay, that's the wedding party on the groom's side. Now Jesus talks about a wedding celebration. And he says, is it appropriate at a wedding for the wedding party to fast? Have y'all ever been to a wedding that you didn't eat food? And we go to rehearsal dinner, right? We got a rehearsal dinner, and then we go to the wedding. We're going to eat another dinner, and we're going to gorge on cake. Jesus is saying this is just not an appropriate time to fast. There's an appropriate time to fast, and there's not an appropriate time to fast, and a wedding ceremony is just not a good time to fast. Now he says when the bridegroom is taken away from them, what will they do then? They will fast and mourn. You don't fast and mourn at a wedding. You fast and mourn at a funeral. There are just appropriate times for it, and there are inappropriate times for it. Are y'all getting where Jesus is going with this? It's inappropriate for my disciples to fast while I'm with them. It would be like the wedding party, fasting at a wedding. That's just improper. It's inappropriate to do that. Now he's got a second illustration. His second illustration is sewing, taking an old garment that's got a hole in it and patching it with an undressed, which means an unshrunk piece of cloth. Now, no tailor in his right mind is going to take a old garment that has been shrunken and take a piece of unshrunk cloth and sew that into that garment, because what's going to happen when you wash it? That unshrunk piece is going to shrink, and it's going to tear loose, and you're going to have a worse hole than you had before. I grew up in a day, Robert, when I grew up, I didn't know anything about anything but Levi's blue jeans. I don't know if they had Wranglers and those other things. All I knew about was Levi's. And we'd go down and buy Levi's, and we always had to buy our Levi's about a size or two too large. Y'all remember? Boy, I was a happy young man when they came out with pre-shrunk blue jeans. I didn't have to guess, how much large I might have to buy these things and make sure when they shrink, I can still wear them. Well, that's the idea here. It is inappropriate, improper, to try to patch an old garment with an unshrunk piece of cloth. It won't work. It'll make the tear worse. In fact, not only will it make the tear worse, you'll lose the patch and you'll lose the garment too. Y'all follow where he's going with this? Third illustration. How about fermenting wine? Of course, in that day, they often put the wine into wine skins, goat skins, sheep skins, so forth and so on, so that the wine could go through the process of fermenting. Now, in the process of fermenting, that wine expands, right? And if you take that new wine and put it into old wine skins that are stiff and brittle, what's going to happen? That expansion is going to bust those wine skins, and not only do you lose the skins, you lose the wines too. So if you want to properly ferment wine, you put this new wine into new wine skins that are elastic, and as the wine ferments, they will expand with the wine and you don't lose them. Y'all follow what he's saying? What has every illustration illustrated? That there's a time that's appropriate for fasting, and there's a time when fasting is not appropriate. And every illustration illustrates that. Do y'all see what Jesus has done? Now, here's what we've got to do. In Richie's opinion, and this is my opinion, and I know this for me because I've gone through this process on a number of occasions in my life. If to be a good Bible student, in my opinion, takes certain qualities. Number one, you got to be honest. You got to be honest enough to look at that text and say, that text doesn't say that. I don't care what the Church of Christ has said. That text doesn't say that, and I got to find out what it means. And secondly, you've got to be courageous. You got to have enough courage that when that text dictates to you, you change your mind about certain things, you change your mind about those things. Are y'all with me? And in my opinion, if we don't have those, at least those two qualities, we're not going to be good Bible students, because we're going to be shackled and bound by opinions and views that went before us that may or may not be right. Now, I'm not throwing rocks at anybody, and I'm not trying, again, to set myself forward as some brilliant guy who has discovered all this stuff that nobody else knew. I'm not the only one who knew this. I'm just saying that I had to wrestle with this text, and I had to come to a conclusion that what I had been taught before is not true based on this text. Now, is the new covenant better than the old covenant? But let's don't go to this text to prove it, because that's the misuse of this text. This text has nothing whatever to say about the covenants, one being superior to the other. It simply has to do with a tradition among men as to when it might be appropriate and when it might not be. When you have a wedding, Jesus said, my disciples shouldn't fast. I'm with them. We're in wedding here. Now, when I die and it becomes funeral time, they'll fast. It'll be appropriate. Okay? Yeah. Oh, well, as far as we are concerned, so go ahead. I'm sorry.
You brought up fasting with the passage.
No, Jesus brought it up. or the Pharisees brought it. No, I'm teasing with you. Of course. And, I mean, I don't know all that you might want to be discussed. You can help me. Of course, the New Testament church, they were still Jews, and they still fasted. It's okay to observe certain religious traditions as long as they're just religious traditions and they're not law and we're not binding them on anyone. We had a guest at our men's breakfast last week. Nguyen, he's a Vietnamese friend of Hao Vu, who is from Ukraine. He was here, and we had a nice breakfast, and I sat across the table from him, and I asked him why he wasn't eating, and he said, "This is my fast day." I said, "Well, do you just do that because that's what you like to do, or is it something religious?" He said, "No, it's just Saturday's my fast day." I said, "Well, that's fine. No problem with that." I said, "I used to fast every Tuesday. That was my fast day for a long time. I don't do that anymore." So it's a matter of opinion. Totally a matter of opinion. Can Wayne decide that Saturday's his fast day and do that as something to worship God, in the sense that I'm going to set that eating time aside to study the Bible or pray? Sure. As long as he keeps that to himself and doesn't tell everybody else they've got to do it. Paul continued to fast on certain occasions. Some fasts were forced on him against his will. So can we as New Testament Christians still practice fasting? Certainly we can. But there's no law in the New Testament like that of the Old Testament that commands us to fast on a certain occasion at a certain time. But we may, by our own will, decide that certain days of the week are times when we want to fast and devote that time to something else. Y'all follow? I don't know. Was there something else? Yeah. Like I say, we find that still going on in the New Testament church. And well, I maybe shouldn't go there. We just leave it at fasting. So, if you want to choose to do that, you're free to do it. But you don't have the right to tell the whole church they have to do it, or even another individual Christian. Okay? But this, of course, was under the Old Testament dispensation and binding tradition of the Pharisees on others. They bound this on others. Now, that doesn't seem so much to come up here, but just the idea of the appropriateness of these things. what do these illustrations illustrate? They illustrate the appropriateness of certain actions under certain circumstances. And under certain circumstances, something can be appropriate. Under another set of circumstances, that same thing might not be. Do y'all follow? I'm getting a lot of blank stares. I hope you're following. I've tried to make it as clear as, yes.
The first of the three illustrations, it's obvious he's talking about fasting. He talks about fasting. The second two, it's not so obvious. There's no mention of fasting, and he's talking about old and new things going together. Can you explain how?
Yes, I can. Take now and try to get the idea. Set the idea of fasting aside for a moment and plug this idea in. Appropriate, inappropriate. Every illustration illustrates something that is appropriate under certain circumstances and inappropriate under other circumstances. And all three illustrations apply to the question about fasting. Fasting, when you have the bridegroom, is just as inappropriate as putting an unshrunk piece of cloth on an old garment. It is just as inappropriate as putting new wine into old wineskins. Every illustration illustrates something that the thing that is appropriate under certain circumstances and not under others. So they all illustrate the same point that's being made. What about fasting? Now, Jesus could have ended with one illustration, right? But he said, let me just give you 3 shots at this. And so he hammered it home 3 times, right? Every sermon ought to have 3 points. That's biblical proof right there. That every sermon ought to have 3 points. So the idea, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate? Fasting is inappropriate at a wedding. It's the same thing as sewing a new patch on an old garment. The same thing as putting new wine into old wineskins. You follow what he's saying? So all of those illustrations illustrate the same point, using what is appropriate under this circumstance and not under that. I hope I've clarified that some. So ask another question. How do Jesus' illustrations answer the question posed to him about fasting? Just go through a series of questions. Just work through these texts by asking certain questions. Well, I think the answer to that question is what we've already given. What's appropriate now that's not appropriate then? Y'all follow? There's nothing here about Old Testament law and New Testament law. There's nothing here about a comparison of the covenants. The question is a question about fasting, not about covenants. And this is where we get off track when we bring something in here that the question doesn't address and the answer doesn't address. Do y'all follow? It's just not there. And then again, the death knell to that position is what Jesus says in Luke chapter 5:39. No man having drunk old wine desires new. Now, if it's a comparison of Old Testament and New Testament, then there's the passage that would do it. And Jesus said, you don't desire the new wine, you like the old is good. Now, if it's a comparison of covenants, Jesus said the old is better than the new. And we know that's not true, right? So, again, yes. Yeah, who? Yeah. No.
Okay, why in verse 20 here does Jesus say that when he's gone, when the bridegroom is gone, they will fast? Why is it appropriate for them to fast then and not us today?
Because for them it's funeral time. When Jesus dies, now you got a funeral. You got a different set of circumstances. It's not wedding time now, it's funeral time. And he's talking about the time of his crucifixion and the days that followed when they mourned before his resurrection. Yeah, they're going to fast then and mourn. So the difference is, what has changed? Now, right now, we're in wedding time. Right then, it's going to be funeral time. And so they will mourn and weep and fast. They don't have any reason right now to do that because I'm with them. Then they're going to have a reason to do it. He's not talking about days of the new covenant. He's talking about the days of Jesus' death. Okay, so narrow your scope down to the time when Jesus died and those few days that surrounded it. You follow me? Now, let me go a step further, and maybe this will help. Does the New Testament covenant forbid us fasting? No. It just doesn't teach us to. It doesn't give us command to do it like unto that command under the Old Covenant. Are we free to choose to do that if we want? Yeah. And we can choose when that time is appropriate for us. Like I say, my day used to be Tuesday. That was my day. I didn't tell anybody about it. It wasn't for anybody but me. I didn't ask anybody to join me. I didn't suggest that anyone was bound to do that just because I did it. That's what I chose to do, and take the time that I spend in eating, to spend my time in prayer, in Bible study, in meditation, and doing these things that for me was a way for Lonnie to serve the Lord. Is that the way that Elaine has to do it? No. If she wants to eat 3 big meals on Tuesday, that's her business. And that may be her way of serving God. In fact, we're going to see a little later that Jesus is going to suggest that by these disciples plucking these grains out of the field and eating them, that's one way they serve Him. Did y'all know we serve God by eating a meal? If we didn't eat that meal, would we have the energy to go and do? No, we need to stop. Take us some food, re-energize ourselves so we can go and serve. On one occasion when this is Mark 6, I think, when Jesus sent the disciples out and they came back from a very arduous missionary journey and they were exhausted from their work, Jesus said, come apart and rest for a while. Did you know when you're sleeping 8 hours at night, you're serving Jesus? Jesus wants you to stay awake 24 hours a day. How good are you going to be tomorrow? No, get your rest. That's serving Jesus too, because that's a part of what we as human beings need so that we can be re-energized to go and serve Him. Somebody observed from that passage in Mark chapter 6 that if we don't come apart and rest a while, we'll just come apart. And they're pretty right on that. So we need the rest, we need the food, and all of this is still serving Jesus. Just because I stopped at Whataburger, and got me a burger before I went and did a football game doesn't mean I'm just a lazy, louse, and all I think about is food. I need that energy on that occasion to go out on the football field and be the servant of God that God would have me be there, right? I'm serving God on that football field too, if I'm who I ought to be. Y'all thought of what I'm saying? So, no, Bill, there's nothing that commands it in the New Testament, permits it. But what Jesus is saying, that when He dies, they're going to mourn. We had a funeral Friday. There was some mourning. Why? It's funeral time. It's not inappropriate at a funeral to cry. Anybody take exception to somebody who cries at a funeral? The only person I know that you might put in that category would be Jesus, strangely enough. When He came to that widow of Nain, had lost her only son, and He met the funeral procession coming out of town, and he stopped the whole thing. Man, they'd throw him in jail. If you stopped a funeral procession, drove in front of that thing and blocked it, that policeman would throw you in jail. Jesus stopped the whole procession. And He looked at that mourning mother and He said, don't cry. And the only thing that I can attach to that in my feeble mind is that Jesus is not objecting to her tears. What He's saying is, sister, I'm going to give you a reason not to cry. And in just a moment, your tears are going to be turned to tears of joy, because I'm going to give that boy back to you. Now, folks, if I could do that, Glenda, I might tell somebody at the funeral, don't cry, but I ain't about to, because I can't do what the Lord did. I'm not going to object to that. Is it wrong for us to object to people who celebrated a wedding and enjoy themselves and kick up their heels, and pat each other on the back? No. What's appropriate at a wedding? rejoicing, feasting. What's appropriate at a funeral? Mourning and fasting. That's just what's appropriate. Are you following? Yeah, go ahead.
So in your mind, the subject of fasting is covered by Romans 14?
Could be, along with many other things. It's a matter of opinion. You agree? Or I know you do.
I'm learning.
You're learning. Well,
At the feet of a great teacher.
uh-huh.
At the feet of a great teacher.
Well, you're at the feet of Jesus then. Sit at the feet of Jesus. Be like Mary and desire the better part, you know. Martha, 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 you're worried about a lot of things, you know. You want to make sure, you know, the casserole's just right and the roast is not overcooked. And Mary desires the better part, and that's sitting at Jesus' feet and learning. Listen, church, I'm a Bible student. And I love being a Bible student. The church paid me a good living salary for 50 years to do what I love to do, to study the Word of God and preach it. And I'm indebted to the Lord for that and to the churches who have supported me. There was never a day in my life that I went to the office that I didn't want to go. Man, I get to go to the church office. I get to go in and sit down and do what I love for as long as I want to do it. I get to work with good people and be surrounded by people of good. Listen, man, the Lord could not have been better to me than He was. But I'm a Bible student. I'm here to challenge you. And I want to challenge you, you know, to look at this text anew. And I've done this. I'm as guilty as anybody is. And I try to correct this as I go along. We need to get the right passage to teach the right thing. We beat the denominational people over the head for misusing Scripture and taking it out of context, then we turn right around and do the same thing and justify ourselves. It's just as wrong for us to do it as for them to do it. Is the new covenant better than the old covenant? Yes, but this passage doesn't teach it, and we don't need to go there to find that teaching, do we? That's the wonderful comfort. If that was the only passage, you know, maybe, you know, we want to twist this a little bit, but it's not. And we have done that too often. And we've got to be honest with ourselves. We've got to be courageous with ourselves and say, look, I was wrong. And I want to be right. And the way for me to be right, as I said, is to hunker down and wrestle with this text and get to its true meaning. What's it all about? It's all about appropriateness. That's what it's about. Not new covenant, old covenant. What is appropriate under these circumstances? The question is about fasting. It's not about covenants. Okay, one more telling note. I brought this up a moment ago. I said I got a little ahead of myself. Luke 5:39. If this discussion related to the two covenants, Jesus said the old is better than the new. You don't desire the new, Jesus said. You don't want that. The old is better. Do y'all desire the new covenant? Come on, help me out. Aren't you glad we're under the new covenant, not the old? We don't want that old one. So if it's about covenants, Jesus said, church, you're wrong. You ought to desire that old stuff and not the new. Y'all follow? I mean, Jesus just turns that whole thing on its head. And here's what I've been guilty of, and I think others have too, but I'll just use, I've too often been guilty of just not listening to Jesus. Jesus said it, but I've already got my mind made up. No, Lord, you're wrong. And let me straighten you out on that matter. No, what did God the Father say on the Mount of Transfiguration? This is my beloved Son. What? Hear Him. We need to listen to Jesus. God of old time spoke through the prophets by various means and in various measures, but now He speaks to us through whom? Help me. His Son. Who do we need to listen to? Listen to Jesus. Okay, boy, I didn't get to that second text, did I? By the way, I'm going to be leaving you in a moment. I've been invited by Hao Vu and Tanya to worship with them at the Vietnamese church today. I will be over there, leaving right after assembly here. I miss being with you in worship, but I've enjoyed our time together in Bible study. So, Real quickly, got 5 minutes. And we pretty much ran through the text, so there's not much else to say. John's disciples, the Pharisees, were fasting. They came and they said to him, "Why do John's disciples, the disciples of the Pharisees, fast, but your disciples do not fast?" It's a situation where they want everybody to be just like them. Boy, what a bunch of oddballs. You know, sometimes, you know, we don't like different people, right? We want you to come in and be just like us. You know? Well, we want people to come in and be just like us as far as being children of God, but we're not all going to dress the same. We're not all going to look the same. You know, we're not all going to act the same all the time, but boy, we just want everybody to be like us. Jesus, you know, the disciples got angry. "Jesus, you go tell that guy over there that's doing those miracles to quit that business. He's not a part of us. You know, he's not in our clique. And so you need to go tell him to hush and quit that business." Jesus said, "Let him alone. He's working in my name. So leave him alone." Everybody wants everybody else to be just like them. And Jesus said unto them, can the sons of the bride chamber, that's the friends of the groom, can they fast while the bridegroom, that's Jesus, is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. That's a wedding. You don't fast at a wedding. "But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away, when he dies on the cross, be taken from them, and then they will fast in that day." Did they mourn? When Peter was in that courtyard, and the Bible says they took Jesus by. Y'all remember this? I think it's Luke that tells us this. He's in the courtyard, you know, warming himself at the fire. And the little girl says, "I know who you are. I saw you with that Galilean." "Not me. I don't even know who the guy is." 3 times. They led Jesus by. I don't know if y'all remember this part of the story. They led Jesus by, and he looked straight in Peter's eye. And it crushed him. And he wept bitterly. He knew he had failed his Lord. He knew his Lord was going to death. It's funeral time. It's time to weep. "No man sews a piece of undressed, unshrunk cloth on an old garment, else that which should fill it takes from it the new from the old, and a worse rent is made." Inappropriate to patch an old garment with a unshrunk piece of cloth. "And no man puts new wine into old wineskins, because the old wineskins are stiff and brittle. The new wine is expanding, it's fermenting. Else the wine will burst these old skins, and the wine perishes." You lose both, the skins and the wine. They put new wine into fresh or new wineskins. So do y'all follow where Richie went? Whether you agree or not, do you understand why I went there? That's what I want you to perceive. And again, in the churches of Christ, let's go to the right passage to prove our points. There is no reason at all for us to ever go to the wrong passage to prove something it doesn't prove. That's wrong to do. And if we hold others responsible for doing that, guilty, then we need to hold our... Do y'all follow what I'm saying? Let's be honest. I don't need that text to prove that the new covenant's better than the old, do I? So let's go to the right text. Let's be honest. Because I tell you what, you go out and you sit down over a coffee table with someone and you teach that's about the covenants. If that guy's a pretty good Bible student, he'll turn you on your ear. Right? Now again, this is it's a process of investigation and a process of growth. There are still things, that we may be missing, that we need some help to get right. But that's what we're looking for, right? We're all beggars looking for bread, right? We're all beggars looking for bread. We're looking for the bread of life. We're searching for the truth of the Word of God. And that will, I think somebody said, Anna Mary, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think somebody in high authority, as I recall, said the truth will set you free. Yeah, somebody said that. If they didn't, I did, so now you can quote me. Okay? All right, thank y'all. I'll miss y'all in the assembly, but I'm looking forward to seeing all of you tonight. God willing, I'll be back then. Thank you.